Welcome, everyone. This is a new series we're starting today. So
Kind of.
well, I guess we're doing a recap of the series we started last fall.
That's right.
Which had to do with the Sermon on the Mount. So, Jay, why are we returning to this particular passage?
Well, I mean, we simply, but we didn't finish it.
Yep.
We got to Christmas, and we got to a natural kind of stop. But we went to Christmas. We went to the New Year. We actually did another series based on this book series. This What If Jesus Was Serious, but the one focused on prayer, because we did think it was really important to take a moment to like, hey, let's really want to grow in our prayer life. It is very important in our living a life with Jesus. And so here we are a year later, starting again.
Yep.
Well, maybe, yeah. And continuing on, with sort of re-looking at some of the stuff that Skye Jethani shares with us based on the Sermon on the Mount with the book, What If Jesus Was Serious?
Yeah, so in the first part, we covered up to basically Matthew chapter 5.
Yeah.
And so that was pretty much half of the book. So for the last half, we're going to look at chapter 6 and chapter 7. And there's lots more teachings of Jesus we can dig out of these two chapters. And I think there's lots of things that not just for his audience then, but for us now, that we need to consider how to apply this in our lives today.
Well, I do think it's really important, because there is an importance about looking into the Sermon on the Mount and taking the time to do that. Because, I mean, I don't know. I don't want to sit there and say it's more important. So at the exclusion of other things Jesus said and did. It's all really, really important. But there are two significant in length discourses found in the Gospels, and one of them is the Sermon on the Mount. The other one is Jesus speaking in the upper room with his disciples, kind of chapter 13 to 17 of John. And I would say, as far as important, and especially in length, discourses, those are really good to look at. And something I just read last night, actually, by Brian Whittle in just his intro to Matthew, which is really pointing to a little of the Sermon on the Mount. I thought was really integral, and I thought added into some of that for me, importance in for me, was that through the life of Jesus, but very specifically the Sermon on the Mount, that's where Gandhi was really inspired to the idea of that pacifist and specifically a nonviolent approach to evil and injustice, was really taken from the life of Jesus, but very specifically the Sermon on the Mount.
Yeah, and I think we can see that in the life of Jesus, we can obviously learn from what he did and how he acted and how he interacted with people. But the two passages we mentioned, including this one, the Sermon on the Mount, are really the core of his teachings.
Very much so.
That he taught the people when he was there. So,
and clearly, as I said, it's inspiring to this day.
Inspiring to this day.
So.
All right, let's maybe what we can do to today is maybe pick out a couple of passages from parts 1 to 4 or from chapter 5 that maybe were significant to you. What kind of looking back do you remember was important to you when you did it?
Well, I mean, I can go on and on about what that could be. I think one of the things, and especially because it's just something I'm really trying to learn and understand for myself, is that of enemy love. You know, it is a very big thing. It's something very specific to Jesus. It is to what Jesus taught, and specifically, just, you know, again, the challenge of what that is, what that looks like. But probably want to pick out, you know, well, part 4 deals a lot with aspects of enemy love,
sure,
and what that looks like. But I mean, just the fact that you know, it's the idea we'll love the people who annoy us every day. You know, and I love that, because it's, you know, I think sometimes when I think of enemy, I get really, you know, instantly I'm thinking something more extreme.
Yeah, and I think back then they actually did have enemies.
Well, I'm sure there are people who now just have
occupied by Romans,
exactly.
And there were robbers on the road, those kind of things. There was a much more dangerous time to live, and so, and even the sort of racial tension between the Jews and the Samaritans, even so, But I think in our particular context, in our culture here in North America, and particularly in Canada, it's harder for us to say who our enemies are. It's more, there's sort of those over across the ocean, or things happening, wars in Ukraine and Russia or whatever, but they're pretty far removed from our day-to-day life.
That's right.
And so I think what Jesus is really zeroing in here is what you just said. And I think Skye brings this out in the book, is the people that really annoy us.
Yeah. Or what we've coined as the other.
The other, yeah.
And it's just that they're somehow different than us. And there comes that enemy. But even the fact that it can frame it into those we love, but are struggling to love in certain moments.
Yeah.
And even says, like, basically taking a moment to identify the quote unquote enemies in our life, just so we understand. I mean, those who you struggle to love, and ask for the grace to love them that day, and it really does help, in my mind, framing enemies that way. But also the little bit I'm sort of learning from some of the writings of Jim Wilder and stuff like that, just the idea of we can go into what's called enemy mode.
Mm-hmm.
And even though that person maybe isn't directly like an enemy, like we're some sort of Bond villain type idea.
Yeah.
But we've gone into some sort of enemy mode, which moves us out of relational mode.
Correct.
And it's just, I really felt like, that was something that I really started learning in, and I really think in this book, Skye led me there. And then the other thing is about anger. Especially the fact that he didn't really sort of sometimes we can say anger is quote unquote bad, but it was basically that even the title of that chapter was "Don't Cultivate Anger," which is really different. It's not saying you don't have it.
Yep.
It's just, what are we doing? Are we doing anything good about it? Are we feeding it? And actually this morning, this was a tweet by Dan White Jr. It said, "Every Christian I know believes their anger is righteous anger. We really need to explore how easy it is to be delusional about our anger."
Mm-hmm.
And I really feel that that's a lot of what he was saying there. And so that was a big thing about that too, is again, it's just really taking time, like our anger there, it's legitimate, it's going on, but make sure we're not self-deluded.
I think anger is a natural emotion.
Exactly.
And you're good. Everybody gets angry.
Yeah.
It's don't cultivate or nurse it.
Yeah. It's just, don't put gas on that fire. It's sort of like, okay, there's a reason for it. It could be good. It could, truthfully, sometimes fuel in a good way to righting certain injustices, which there is that. But when we cultivate it, it becomes more hurtful, and sometimes we're not good aimers.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think in our, particularly in the Christian culture, there's just a little too much cultivation of what we would call righteous anger, but I think you're right. I think a lot of times it is self-delusional.
Well, I think sometimes it can be. And even if there's some really good points there, we got to be careful that we're aiming in the right direction. And maybe sometimes we need to trust that Jesus can, and maybe we aren't always the best at that.
Yeah. And I think there's a point here where we kind of skipped over, is that I think praying for enemies,
yes,
praying for the things that make us angry, do help us keep us in a relational mode. So instead of isolating or pushing back or just keeping away from, or even attacking or opposing, it's important to stay in relationship so we can have a conversation and hopefully resolve some of our differences.
Yeah. If that is something that can happen. I think the other thing I just would onto that is just the ability to not see people in sometimes really, we'll say, black and white terms.
Yeah.
Is the idea of like, they maybe have done something, but there's a human behind that maybe there is some sort of thing that is going on that, like, not that it makes what was done okay, but it does sort of like, okay, you're a human. I can understand and love that there's some through hurt or whatever that's there. And again, not to say that it's okay, but to see a real person.
Yeah. And that only comes when we're in a relational mode where we can actually take the time to ask, is there something else going on?
Yeah.
Kind of stuff. And that kind of leads into what was kind of a highlight for me in the first half of the book, was that we cannot separate our relationship with God from our relationship with others, and how we treat others is how our Heavenly Father will treat us. And that's a pretty scary statement sometimes, because I'm not always the best at treating others how even I want to be treated, let alone how I want God to treat me.
Yeah, I can relate to that too.
Yeah, and particularly, how God's forgiveness only comes with the condition that we actually forgive others. And I meant to look it up, but it reminded me of the parable of the wicked servant, the guy who owed the king a lot of money, and the king forgives this big, huge debt, and he goes out and finds someone who owes him $10 and puts him in debtor's prison or whatever until he could pay back. And so he didn't really learn anything about, in this case, the parables are always about ourselves and God. And in the end, God treated him like he treated others. So that's a very poignant thing that came across for me. And I know one of the authors I really like, Reggie Joyner, says that we prove our love for God by loving the people around us. All of them, even the enemies. That kind of links back to our earlier comments.
Yeah, that's right.
And I like Skye says in the book too that we desperately want to believe that we ourselves can stand blameless before God and yet still utterly despise, mistreat, and condemn those made in his image.
And yeah, that hopefully, it leaves us in a place of some serious self-reflection.
Yeah, and humility. And the other thing too that came out is sort of an age-old Christian dilemma, I guess, is that in the book, Skye talks about that both evangelism and justice matter. And typically we see churches pick one or the other.
Yes.
So they usually follow along the lines of they're going to put justice first, and others put evangelism first, and they actually antagonize each other over their choices. And typically, unfortunately, it falls along political lines. So conservatives,
very much so.
They're focused on evangelisms that lives must be transformed first by the gospel, and then the world will be changed. And sort of the traditional liberal point of view is we must commit to ending evil in the world first, so that people will believe our message. And typically we just butt heads about it day and night. And I really like that Skye says that really neither is our motivation. That kind of stopped me right there. That the motivation is not justice or evangelism. It's actually love.
Yeah. And it encompasses both of those things and at the same time holds them in tension.
Exactly. And I think when love is our motivation, that's really the core of Jesus' teaching. Jesus, when asked, I was actually in my reading this morning, they're trying to trick Jesus and ask him what's the most important of the laws. And these guys are lawyers basically. And whatever Jesus says, they're hoping to argue with him as to which is more important or least important. And he gives an answer to love God and to love others. Yeah. And in the particular passage I read, it's actually the Pharisees or the lawyers who say, yes, all of the commandments really hang on those too. So that's an interesting point of view. And then really it comes down to not just Jesus' teaching, but if you look at the whole story of God, the main attribute of God is love.
Yes. Yeah, so that is kind of where we've been, and we hope that, maybe it's been a year and you got to dust off that particular book or whatnot. But one of the, I think, the things we really hope that will continue on and even more so in the next coming months as we go through this is coming back to this place of identity that's really found in the Sermon on the Mount. So much of it is about Jesus saying this is what it means to be a citizen in the kingdom of God.
Right.
And really reframing, what true identity, that identity that's been established in us right from the creation, reframing it, recontextualizing it, in that moment, in that time, and for us taking this Sermon on the Mount. And I think Skye helps us so beautifully with this to recontextualize it, what it means, making sure that we understand the seriousness of Jesus was in this, and to with his grace, with his power, with his love, come back into that identity and see how it works in today and in the fall of 2022, and also to call each other back to the identity,
Yeah.
because we're human, and as we said, there's a few moments we've definitely been like, yeah, we're not so great at this part, but in a loving community, we're calling each other back to into that reality, and into
holding
that
each other
identity.
accountable. And I think that's a really important point. The idea that to be citizens of the kingdom of heaven means there is an identity that's set forth by Jesus in this teaching that, as we've talked about earlier in the year, that was God's intention from the very beginning anyway. And he's calling us back to that. But you're right. We live in a particular time, in a particular place. And so that identity has to be applied in where we live, both now and back in Jesus' times.
Right. All right. So what we're going to do is, you can start this week. We're going to just every week there will be videos in this format that will be released, so you can kind of follow along that way. We will be having in our in-person services, we'll be preaching about some of the topics and all that come along in not only in the What If Jesus Serious book, but really what we're seeing in the Sermon on the Mount. So that will be in our in-person times. Again, if you look for this book, if you haven't seen it for for close to a year, if not, let us know. We can get you a copy of the book. And in the meantime, in this kind of 1 week, as we set up this intro, and in 1 week from today, we will be meeting in person. You might say, hey, how can I catch up a little bit? Well, if you're a reader, you can read parts 1 to 4 if you think you can do that in a week, because the nice thing about this book is each chapter is pretty short and pretty sweet and full of a lot of great stuff like that.
And I think the other thing they can do is literally just read Matthew chapter 5.
Or they can just read, that might be literally, you could probably do that in about 5 minutes.
Yeah, and I think that will bring to mind some of the things we talked about. And again, if you do come across something that you want a little more clarification on, you can go back. All the videos from that part of the series are available online right here on our YouTube channel.
Right. So great. Thank you so much. We're looking forward to this journey together over the next few months into specifically chapter 6 and 7 of the Sermon on the Mount, as well as just a little bit what Skye Jethani has put together for us to just hopefully understand more and more about this really, really very important discourse that Jesus had.
Yeah, we hope you'll join us next week, and we'll hope to see you then.